Justin Welby, the first Archbishop of Canterbury to quit in shame. Today, his first and only interview since he stepped down, when the Church was accused of covering up hideous abuse and he fell short.
Just for the avoidance of doubt, I am utterly sorry and feel a deep sense of personal failure.
What will the victims make of Welby's explanations now?
Justin Welby continues to refuse to meet, to refuse to answer our questions, and walks by on the other side. Whatever he says, he walks by on the other side.
With us live this morning, the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper and Alex Burghart from the Conservatives, the shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. And at the desk for the next 60 minutes, Dame Jasvinder Sanghera, dismissed from safeguarding at the Church of England after falling out with senior bishops, columnist and broadcaster Jane Moore, and Cambridge professor Jason Arday. Morning, morning. Today we will get straight to it. Justin Welby became Archbishop of Canterbury in 2013, the occupant of a job that's stitched into the fabric of our national life, way beyond religion. But his tenure came to an abrupt and embarrassing end when, in November, an independent report into allegations of horrific abuse by a barrister, John Smythe, who Welby knew, found that there'd been a cover-up, and the Archbishop himself had not done enough to act. Now, just Bishop Justin, he was in charge during an era of turmoil for the country, not just in the Church of England. Archbishop of Canterbury, Councillor to the Royals, spiritual guide of 86 million worshippers worldwide.
At 6, the Archbishop of Canterbury resigns. He says he's doing so in sorrow and with a profound sense of shame.
He quit after an official report revealed his and the Church's failings over abuse.
It is clear that I had to stand down.
I'm John Smythe.
John Smythe abused over 100 children and young men in England and Africa. Behaviour known to Justin Welby as early as 2013. But allegations weren't pursued properly by Welby or the Church. Smythe died before being held to account. 4 months since he quit in shame, here's the now former Archbishop's first and only interview. So how did he get it so badly wrong?
It's the first time that you've spoken like this since you made the decision to resign. Why did you go?
I went, as I said at the time, out of a sense of both personal responsibility for shortcomings during my time and my own shortcomings, and out of a sense of institutional responsibility for the long-term revelations of cover-up and failure over a long period.
But when an official report said that you could and should have done more to take action against the abuser in the Church, John Smythe, who abused more than 100 young people, at first you tried to stay on, and it was later that you resigned. So what changed your mind?
What changed my mind was having been caught by the report being leaked and not really thought it through enough, to be honest. Over that weekend, as I reread it, and as I reflected on the horrible suffering of the survivors, which had been, as many of them said, more than doubled by the institutional Church's failure to respond adequately, it increasingly became clear to me that I needed to resign.
What exactly do you think you did wrong?
I think I was not sufficiently pushy in a way that I would have been a few years later. I have first heard about Smythe's offences in August of 2013. I'd been in post 11 weeks. And safeguarding had been the crisis I hadn't foreseen. I didn't realise how bad it was. And when I arrived and found that the total safeguarding staff at the centre was half of one person, and equivalent around the diocese. And then this report came from Ely Diocese of abuse of one person who'd reported it to their bishop. And we didn't see all the details till 2017. I should have pushed harder because I knew enough to know that people very rarely, almost never, abuse once. I should have said, are we absolutely sure there's no one else involved?
But why didn't you? I mean, this was 2013. The police had got involved. There'd previously been high-profile prosecutions even of clergy in the 2000s.
Absolutely.
We're not talking about the 1950s, the 1960s, the kind of era in this country when people just didn't talk about this kind of thing. Why didn't you care enough?
I cared, I wasn't curious enough.
Well, you said previously, I didn't care sufficiently. You didn't care sufficiently about young people being
on that
abused.
first report, that's a very fair comeback.
So
on that report,
why?
You're right. One thing was the rules of the time said that cases are investigated by the diocese where they're reported. The second thing was the police said, don't interfere. A few years later, I would have pushed harder. That's the technical reason. The other reason was, actually, you mentioned other criminal cases. Peter Ball, Bishop Peter Ball, who was in the middle of his trial and being sent to prison. And I was very focused on that. I was also finding that every day more cases were coming across the desk that had been in the past, hadn't been dealt with adequately. And this was just, it was another case. And yes, I knew Smythe, but you can't, it was an absolutely overwhelming few weeks. Now, that's not an excuse. It's a reason, it's not an excuse.
But the police had been called
And
over allegations of abuse being carried out by someone you knew.
Exactly.
You'd been warned years before in a different context that he wasn't a nice man.
It was overwhelming. One was trying to prioritise. And we knew with Peter Ball that there were numerous victims and survivors, one of the victims had committed suicide. That was so horrific and it seemed so much bigger. But I think it's easy to sound defensive over this. The reality is I got it wrong. I did not do, as Archbishop, there are no excuses. Being overwhelmed is a reason, it isn't an excuse.
Some of the victims of John Smythe think that you were tone deaf. You took years to meet them. You didn't follow up that allegation, even though you knew the police were involved.
I certainly, since then, with the victims of Smythe that I'd met, and I'd met them before, back in 2020 or 2021 on an online thing, because it was COVID, I said sorry. And certainly, as I've met the ones who wanted to meet me, I have said sorry very much. And just for the avoidance of doubt, I am utterly sorry and feel a deep sense of personal failure, both for the victims of Smythe not being picked up sufficiently after 2017 when we knew the extent of it, and for my own personal failures.
The victims of Smythe, and indeed other abusers in the church, feel that the culture was significantly to blame for the fact that they weren't taken seriously. And the fact that when you made your speech in Parliament, you cracked some jokes, you talked about being technically in charge when you were in charge, you talked about a head having to roll. That caused profound upset.
It did cause profound upset, and I am profoundly ashamed of that, and I apologised within 24 hours, and I remain deeply ashamed. It's one of those moments where, when I think of it, I just wince. It was entirely wrong and entirely inexcusable.
What were you thinking?
I wasn't in a good space at the time. I shouldn't have done a valedictory speech at all.
Because some victims believe actually the fact that for whatever reason you saw fit to joke about what had happened in public is revealing of the problem all along, is that senior people in the church for many years just haven't got it. And the church tactic is deny, delay, sometimes even denounce the victims.
I can absolutely understand why they should think that. It's not the case. A lot has changed. And if you look at our safeguarding now, for current cases, we have something close to 60 people in Church House in Westminster who work on training, on equipping, and on investigation. And the big thing, the front line, is every parish has a parish safeguarding officer.
And yet there's still no mandatory reporting in the church. There's still not a fully independent safeguarding system, which many people believe the only way to put this in order is to say the church can't handle this. You need to get an outside organisation.
And you would know from looking back over what I've said that I am entirely in favour of independent safeguarding.
And you were the boss for more than 10 years and it didn't happen.
It didn't happen because you have to get it through the General Synod.
So why don't they want it? Why they're resistant? And I think a lot of people watching this will be wondering, not just about what happened in your time in church, but what is it more generally about religious organisations that find problems of abuse when they emerge so hard to deal with?
The Archbishop of Canterbury is not the chief executive of Church of England plc. You can't make things change by saying this will now happen. Otherwise, we'd have had independent safeguarding when I first raised it in 2016. Most vicars are doing a wonderful job, the overwhelming majority. The church has grown over the last few years. And it is very, very hard, and you'd know this from within organisations where you've worked, including your own. You hear something, you think, that him? It's always a him, almost. That can't be true.
And is that what you thought when you heard about John Smythe?
Oh, absolutely not. No. I totally believed that this was, as is quite well known, I had a fairly difficult upbringing. I'm well experienced personally on the issues of abuse. And I always start that when someone declares abuse, divulges abuse, I start by taking it. My rule is you always take it seriously.
And yet you've just said you believed it. You knew the police were involved, and then yet you still didn't follow it up. That's what makes this so extraordinary.
If you have a message from the police saying, under no circumstances are you to get involved because you will contaminate our inquiry.
But checking up on what happened next
and as I said, I should have done that. I should have pestered them, to be honest. And I see that now. I mean, you're quite right to raise the point.
I just want to be clear, to your knowledge, how many people are still on the church payroll or perhaps retired who knew about Smythe's abuse?
What I know is that the National Safeguarding Team, about 3 weeks ago, issued a statement, which you probably saw, which said that there were, it was roughly a dozen who were being taken to the disciplinary process. A lot have died, but there are a dozen who are going through a CDM, clergy discipline measure. And incidentally, at that time, they said they hadn't discovered anything that I'd done or not done, omitted to do, which would warrant CDM, which was an interesting point. I still feel responsible, but that's a different question.
Let's move on then, because you presided over the Church of England for more than 10 years, and there were huge changes during that time and a lot of turmoil in this country. And you presided over royal weddings, of course, Her late Majesty's funeral, and of course, a coronation. I just wonder, what was your most meaningful moment?
I think the late Queen's funeral. The experience of that week. An extraordinary moment of being aware of the turn of history.
Let us commend to the mercy of God, our Maker and Redeemer, the soul of Elizabeth, our late Queen.
It was a beautiful sunny day. I was standing at the door of Westminster Hall, waiting for the coffin, and you heard from the distance the cheers, and then as it got closer, the sighs, the groans almost. The coronation, I mean, the greatest privilege one could ever ask for was to be involved in that.
God save the King!
God save the King! The most significant moment of that service for me was the anointing, which of course was behind the screen.
There has also, alongside lots and lots of turmoil in the UK, in the last 10 years, been a lot of changes in our culture and also how we talk to each other. And
Indeed.
There's been a speeding up, if you like, of public conversation that's often more vitriolic.
Yes.
Is that something that you've observed? Is that something you worry about?
Yes. I think the biggest challenge long-term this country faces is social cohesion. Whether you are in favour or against or neutral, we are now certainly in the top 2 or 3, possibly the most diverse nation on earth. And that has happened in half a century. And the challenge of that is working out who we are. People want a cohesive society. They want a society where we know who we are and what we value and where we're going. And this is where the church plays its role.
You wrote, though, about social media last year that we can hate at a distance.
Yes.
And because of the intimacy or a tweet or a blog post, that hatred cuts into us. Do you think we rush to judge now?
I think we rush to judge. The first question one hears on most interviews, I heard one yesterday, is, are you going to resign? And having been the object of that question, it's a very difficult one to answer, because you think, am I letting people down? Is it the right thing to do? You know, it's a complicated question. I think there is a rush to judgment. There is this immense, and this goes back half a century, immense distrust of institutions. And there's a point where you need institutions to hold society together. And there's an absence, I'm not talking about safeguarding here, there is an absence of forgiveness. We don't treat our leaders as human. We expect them to be perfect. If you want perfect leaders, you won't have any leaders.
There was, of course, a huge frenzy around what happened to you. I mean, you had a farewell party at Lambeth Palace that was highly criticised. I think there was even a donation to a children's charity that was publicly refused.
That is correct, by the Children's Society, yeah.
I mean, do you feel that you were cancelled, if you like, in this modern frenzy?
We won't know that for 30 or 40 years, and I'll be dead by that time. I don't know. I can't answer that question. You'd have to ask others. I know that I let God down. I let people down.
So you were in charge of the church for more than 10 years. There were vigorous conversations during that time about same-sex relationships and about women. As we talk today, women can still be refused by some parishes, and gay people still can't have the same kind of celebration in a church as straight people. They can't have
Exactly.
legal marriage in the Church of England.
Or even a service of blessing in every church. Yeah.
In what way, then, can people look at that and think the church reflects the modern UK, where both women and gay people are treated as second-class citizens?
The Church of England is one part of 85 million people in 165 countries with over 2,000 cultures and languages. The average Anglican is a woman in her 30s in sub-Saharan Africa on less than $4 a day, a woman. The changes have been enormous. So, coming back to the UK, I'm not trying to avoid your question, I'm trying to put it in context. Coming back to the UK, if I were to say to you, do you agree on everything with all of your extended family? I suspect you'd say no, because I don't know anyone who'd say yes, and be honest. The church is not a self-selecting club. It is the family of Christ. It is God's family. And we disagree amongst each other, but that doesn't stop us being family. And the role of the Archbishop and of the bishops is to allow people to remain in the family without totally dismissing standards that are essential.
But in that family, as it stands, gay people and women might be entitled to think they're not as welcome. They're not equal members of the family. And some people also in the church might feel that it was more the Archbishop of Canterbury's role to lead this rather than to fudge it in order to try to keep that family together. What do you say to that?
I would say there's a practical political reason. You have to get it through the General Synod of the Church of England.
So are they out of date?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying they have very different views. And there isn't a big enough majority to get it through. You need a 2/3 majority under the rules Parliament set. And we wouldn't have got women bishops through if we hadn't made provision for those who on theological grounds have a different view.
Is it disappointing to you, though, as somebody who
Yes.
wanted that to happen? So
Yes.
you left the job disappointed at the...
Yes. Yes.
And let's just end then where we began. Your career as Archbishop of Canterbury, the most senior job anybody in your position could have dreamt of, ended in a very public and a very painful way. But you've mentioned today, and you've written and talked before a lot about forgiveness. Would you like the victims of John Smythe to forgive you?
Obviously, but it's not about me. When we talk about safeguarding, the centre of it are the victims and survivors. I have never, ever said to a survivor, you must forgive, because that is their sovereign, absolute, individual choice. Everyone wants to be forgiven, but to demand forgiveness is to abuse again.
The Macon report, though, the official report into this, does suggest, it says it's really unlikely that you didn't know anything before 2013.
I you can believe it or not, I did not have a clue.
You wrote, to forgive is not to pretend that nothing's happened. It's the opposite. It accepts the full weight of the wrong. Do you forgive John Smythe?
Yes. I think if he was alive and I saw him, but it's not me he's abused. He's abused the victims and survivors. So whether I forgive or not is, to a large extent, irrelevant. What matters is, are the survivors and everyone responds differently to abuse, but are the survivors sufficiently loved by the church and cared for and are enabled, liberated to rebuild their lives? After that, you can start talking about forgiveness.
And we know many of his victims don't feel that the church has shown them love.
Exactly.
And they don't feel that you showed them moral leadership.
Yes.
How do you think a victim of John Smythe might react to you saying that you could forgive him? Because he didn't abuse you.
I would say exactly what I just said. It's not about whether I do. Yes, you asked me a question, I gave an honest answer. But I also said that that's irrelevant. The point is the church, nobody's going to say to them, you must forgive. I've never said it to a survivor, I never would. But is the church behaving in a way and loving in a way, and it hasn't, in a way that enables people to have that choice freely for themselves, and not because some archbishop has said it's a good thing. That's what matters.
Justin Welby, thank you so much for speaking to us
Thank you
today.
very much.
Well, we showed the interview to one of Smythe's victims, known as Graham. He didn't want to show his face, but he was happy to give us his perspective. So what did he make of Justin Welby saying he forgives John Smythe?
I came forward 13 years ago, and what the church has put me through makes the historic abuse pale into insignificance. It's been the most extraordinary, traumatic journey, trying to get answers, trying to get any kind of support. I don't care about Smythe.
Justin Welby said the reason, or one of the reasons he hadn't acted back in 2013 was because there was an overwhelming number of cases and he'd been overwhelmed by what was going on. What did you make of that explanation?
If this case, and I've got notes from a subject access request that state quite clearly blood, state quite clearly underage boys getting beaten, if that was not a priority, then what was? You may be swamped by other cases, but if this one wasn't fairly close to the top of the pile, what was? He had a direct contact into the camps, his knowledge of John Smythe, whether he was overwhelmed or not, this was a priority.
And why do you think it wasn't then? I mean, do you believe what he said today, that there was simply too much going on, that he wasn't able to make it a priority? Or do you think he's still scrabbling around for explanations for something that many people struggle to understand?
Oh, I think he's scrabbling around for explanations. I think there was an awful lot in that interview which just has me shouting at the screen saying, no, that's just not right. The church still is overwhelmed with abuse cases. It is no better at dealing with them. There are people coming forward week in, week out who don't trust the church, who go to other advocates who will work on their behalf. The church is no better at dealing with this than it ever was and remains overwhelmed.
Justin Welby said, for the avoidance of doubt, that he really is sorry. Do you accept his apology? Do you believe he means it?
Laura, I've said before that if in 2017 he had contacted us, said, I will come and apologise to you personally, I am sorry, I messed up, I would have forgiven him immediately. But he never has in those terms.
And will you ever forgive him?
Not if he continues to blank us and refuses to tell us the truth. We're the victims. We deserve to know what happened, and we don't yet.
Well, the Church of England told us they're deeply sorry for the abuse John Smythe's survivors suffered, and they said if anyone comes forward to the Church today with a concern, they'll be heard and responded to carefully and compassionately. In the past 10 years, the Church has developed and strengthened its safeguarding policies and practices. Let's then talk to our panel about what we heard in that interview. And we should also say much of this came out because of dogged and very good journalism from our colleagues over at Channel 4, which they started on this many years ago. But Jasvinder, you were working for the Church in exactly this area. Yeah. What went through your mind watching that and hearing Justin Welby say he could forgive John Smythe?
Well, I was the independent survivor advocate for the Independent Safeguarding Board, and all I was feeling was a sense of overwhelming feeling for all those victims that have been let down for years and decades. You know, he talks about feeling overwhelmed. Think how it must feel for them. I mean, this language like shortcomings, wasn't pushy enough. The rules at the time meant I couldn't act. I'm sorry, that's absolute rubbish. The bottom line is leaders must act with courage and conviction. I can tell you with absolute conviction today that survivors, the treatment of survivors hasn't changed.
It hasn't changed?
No, it absolutely hasn't. I mean, I'm still supporting those survivors that were let down by the Church of England when I was removed, and they're still in the same position. Archbishop of York is still not meeting them. You know, the parallels in terms of Justin Welby, he could have done something in 2013. He has prevented justice. But when I look at the Archbishop of York and Tudor, again, excuses. It seems to me, and what we're not getting here is the Church is an unaccountable body. You know, we're having a conversation today about mandatory reporting. That has been watered down. Nobody is going to be held to account. We're not going to get mandatory reporting either.
Jane, were you surprised when Justin Welby said he would forgive John Smythe?
I gasped, actually. I mean, there was so much to unpack in that interview, but you know, the old Edmund Burke quote, evil is what happens when good men do nothing. And he is the epitome of what you would expect to be or describe as a good man. And he did nothing. And, you know, we're not talking about some minor sort of failing here. You know, private schools, all schools, we know if something happens in their school that, I'm not about abuse, but they sort of move it on because they don't want the bad publicity. This is what they've done. But this is wide-scale, terrible abuse. And for somebody like him to even have an inkling that there's something like that going on and to just go, actually, I'm just going to leave this up to other people, I find astonishing.
Jason, you're a Christian and a member of the Church of England. After all of this, though, do you think that organisation you're a member of, do you think they can still claim moral authority?
I think his actions have compromised the moral authority of the Church, and as a consequence of that, people's, you know, the distrust amongst the public is going to be palpable. It's going to be extremely strong. And I think when he mentions it being a deep sense of personal failure, I think that is exactly what it is. It's a systemic issue as well. But I also think there's been a lot of focus on Justin's actions, which have been poor. Very poor. And I think that the focus needs to be on the victims and the kind of psychological safeguarding of the victims and the support for those individuals.
And yet, Jane, I mean, Justin Welby does also clearly believe, and I think some people in political circles might agree with him, that there is sometimes a real frenzy and a rush to judgment of leaders, even when they're dealing with very sensitive and complicated issues. Do you have any sympathy with that? Do you think he has a right to make those sorts of comments given what's happened?
I have sympathy in other situations. So I've heard him interviewed in the past where he's maybe spoken about politicians and the pressure that they're under. Little did he know that he would himself be under that pressure at this point. But I think when it comes to wide-scale abuse of children, all bets are off. I don't think you can mitigate with, oh, well, you know, so-and-so put a bit of pressure on me. And of course, among the pressure is the survivors, the victims and the survivors wanting answers. So, you know, yes, the media have put pressure. Yes, there's been a lot of online pressure from people, but there's a reason for that.
Jasvinder, we're going to talk to the Home Secretary in a couple of minutes' time. And this has, been your life's work, really, is working in safeguarding and trying to protect vulnerable people. More broadly, is safeguarding up to scratch in the UK?
No, it's not. And we're going to miss a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity if we don't have mandatory reporting.
So what do you mean by that for people who haven't been following it closely?
The thing here is that it's been watered down. Mandatory reporting should mean that if you suspect, if you believe a child is going to be abused...
In any organisation, school, church,
absolutely,
anywhere.
You have a responsibility and a duty to report that. As it stands, it's been put on the employer to do a referral to DBS. I mean, no employer is going to do that. If I think about the Church of England, their focus is reputational damage. So they're not going to want that at all. So, we've got to think about this space in terms of the protection of individuals. And the only way you're going to do that is to create a culture that really speaks out to this, and we all play a part. And mandatory reporting will give that buzz.
OK, well, that's really interesting to hear your views. All three of you. We'll be back with you later in the show.
Thank you.
And of course, really important to say, if you or someone you know has been affected by this kind of issue and needs help or support, there is lots of it out there. You can look at the BBC's Action Line. The website address is there for you now on the screen, and that can take you to all sorts of organisations who can help and support. Let's then talk to the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, who's with us this morning.
Good morning, Laura.
Good morning. Just first of all, what did you think when you heard Justin Welby say that he forgave John Smythe?
Well, I think your whole interview, Laura, was a reminder, really, of not just the scale of child sexual abuse and exploitation, but also the scale of failure for a series of institutions, not just the Church of England, but other institutions as well, to take seriously these appalling crimes. Look, I'm not a deeply religious person, and so people respond in different ways. I think, having seen a series of different, just appalling crimes, when you look at the details of those, personally, I find it very difficult to forgive terrible criminals for different crimes that they have committed. But fundamentally, this needs to be about survivors and victims, and it's for them to make sure that they are at the heart of this. We're going to be setting out next week some plans around a victims panel, victims and survivors panel, to ensure that we are taking much stronger action nationally on child sexual abuse and exploitation.
And it's an issue we've discussed at length before, but we just heard there from Jasvinder, who's spent her life doing this. Clearly, she believes very strongly what you're proposing around making reporting of any abuse suspicions mandatory doesn't go nearly far enough. She says you're going to miss a once-in-a-generation opportunity to draw a line and to change the culture, whether it's in schools, church, councils, wherever people might have suspicions or concerns.
Well, we're bringing forward the new law in Parliament to introduce mandatory reporting, and that will be a requirement on anybody that's covered by the sort of disclosure and barring service. In other words, that anybody that's got that protected work with children will have an obligation to report any suspected child abuse. And we're also strengthening that by making it a criminal offence for anyone who then tries to prevent reporting or tries to cover it up. So much stronger criminal
very
sanctions.
Clearly that actually if you leave it up to employers, they're not going to go and check it out. People won't do it. It won't make enough of a difference. Is she wrong?
Well, the responsibility is on those who work with children, and for them to be able to make those reports, and it is a mandatory duty to report. But there is also making it a criminal offence to prevent the reporting. So if an organisation covered up a report or tried to block someone reporting child abuse, then that would be a criminal offence. So that is strengthening the culture. Now, look, we want to make sure that we're taking action, strengthening child protection across the board in a series of different ways, tackling both child sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation, including online, which is one of the areas that's growing fastest as well.
And when that law is passed, is it conceivable then that church leaders, perhaps even Justin Welby, might have been prosecuted or could even be prosecuted in future if they failed to report?
Well, it would depend on the details of a case, but if an organisation, institution or an individual is blocking the reporting of child abuse and is effectively covering it up, then that does become a criminal offence.
OK. He then potentially could be considered under that, or church leaders who knew about Smythe?
I can't comment or speculate on individual cases.
OK. Let's then talk about something in your in-tray, huge issue of immigration. There's a big immigration summit in London this week. People from all sorts of countries are coming. But we've talked to you a lot about this issue, and 9 months into government, the numbers of migrants coming to the UK illegally by small boats surpassed 5,000 this week. That's more than the same period in 2024. It's more than the same period in 2023. It's more than the same period in 2022. Why do you think what you've tried so far doesn't appear to be working?
Well, boat crossings remain high. That is very serious and dangerous, and it's one of the reasons that we're holding this international summit. It's the first time this has ever been done on organised immigration crime, and it's bringing together over 40 countries from across the world, because we know that this is a global criminal industry that is worth billions of pounds, undermining border security and putting lives at risk. And what we've seen in the last few months, we've seen, I think January and February had lower levels of crossings than previous years. March had much higher levels. And the really unacceptable situation that we're in is because of the way the criminal gangs have taken hold, our border security ends up being dependent on the weather, and we cannot continue like this, where the number of calm days affects the number of crossings and affects our border security as well.
Why do you think what you've done in the last 9 months isn't yet working? Why not?
So the criminal gangs have had 8 years to take hold along the channel, and we have been taking the action for around 8 months.
And the things that we've had during that time compared with last year. And you've been telling us for months, we spoke to you in Italy in December, you've been busy going around the world, trying to take action, trying to get deals, but the numbers are going the wrong way. So why is it not working?
So I've obviously set out the issues that we've had in January, February and March. We've seen higher numbers in March, lower numbers in January and February, and that's reflected in the number of calm days. We cannot carry on with border security being so dependent on the number of calm days that happen in the Channel, but the reason that is happening is because the criminal gangs still have a deep hold. So the action that we are taking to address this is much stronger action with France, including new measures that will take place in the course of this year. France has agreed now to take action and to intervene in French waters. They've never done that before. That is a big and important change, and the previous government tried to implement that. This is something that we have managed to achieve as a result of our close working with France.
But the question I think people have is, you've been busy doing all of these things. You've just reminded us of some of the actions you have taken, but it doesn't seem to be working. And this week you're going to try to, again, to make it harder for businesses to employ illegal immigrants. For the first time, they could be prosecuted for that, even if they're casual workers. How many people do you think you're going to be able to catch in that by changing that?
Well, we've had a 40% increase in illegal working raids since the elections. So some of the changes that we've made that are having an impact already is a 20% increase in returns, over 19,000 people returned who have no right to be in the UK, and we'll update those figures shortly. And then also a nearly 40% increase in illegal working raids and arrests. But we need to do more, because this is not reaching the gig economy, where employers don't have to do eligibility for work checks, and you can end up with criminal gangs promise people illegal work just as they then take their money for illegal crossings. So how many people do you expect then to be able to pin down by changing these rules? How many people? Well, we'll introduce the rules. That will be part of the legislation, and then we will continue to ramp up the scale of enforcement. So what we need is for employers themselves to take action that prevents the illegal working in the first place. So some of this is about us increasing enforcement, but some of this is the prevention action that we need employers to take. So that's why it's difficult to put single figures on it, because you need both the prevention side and also the enforcement side, because the rules need to be respected and enforced. And frankly, for far too long, they just haven't been.
But some people in the opposition would say, actually, what you're doing is you're making lots of small changes all over the place, trying to sort of fiddle with the dials rather than doing something much more radical. But in the last few weeks, there have been reports that you are reviewing what's called Article 8, so part of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is meant to guarantee right to a family life. Now, everyone watching will have heard those stories when someone who's come here illegally, who appears to be using that to try to stay in the UK, when actually many people will think they don't have a right to be here, they should be deported. Is it correct? Can you confirm that you are looking at changing how that law is applied here?
Well, we continue to support international law. That is really important, and it's because we support international law that we've managed to get new agreements with France and Germany. There have been some cases that do raise some real significant concerns, and that is also about the way in which the immigration asylum system operates. It's about the application, including of Article 8, as the Prime Minister has said. So we are reviewing all of this area to make sure that really the immigration asylum system works effectively in the way that Parliament meant it to, and make sure that there is a sort of proper sense of control in the system.
And just lastly, in the last week alone, there have been stories about what many viewers, I think, will think are almost sort of unbelievable heavy-handedness from the police. There was a couple who were contacted by the police about what had happened in a school WhatsApp group. There was a woman in Leicestershire who was allegedly foraging mushrooms, who had the police come to her house. Reports on the front of the Sunday Times this morning about a Quaker house that had a police raid. Are you a bit worried that the police are getting a bit heavy-handed?
Well, I've made clear to the police that the priorities, this government's priorities for policing, are reducing serious violence. That includes knife crime, violence against women and girls, and we've set a mission to halve serious violence over the next 10 years.
So not raiding Quaker houses or going to the house of people who've been foraging for mushrooms.
Bringing back neighbourhood policing, tackling those crimes in town centres, like the shoplifting, mobile phone theft, antisocial behaviour in town centres, because those are the things that really impact on confidence in communities. We're introducing a new performance framework for police, so those will be the issues they'll be measured on. Of course, we have operational independence for policing, and so police forces themselves need to take decisions on individual cases.
But I think you're diplomatically, without wanting to step over the line, saying they should maybe focus on other things. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, it's always great to have you with us in the studio, especially on a special programme this morning. Thank you for your time. Now, remember, of course, as ever, we want to know what you think. You can email us, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or on social media. If you're that way inclined, you can use the hashtag BBC Laura Kay on all the different platforms. And you can message us on WhatsApp too. The number is there for you now. It's 08000 282 161, and we'll share some of that with you later in the show and in our newsletter every Thursday. You must know the drill by now. Well, Alex Burghart, the Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, essentially Kemi Badenoch's deputy, I suppose that's fair? Oh, you're shaking your head,
I'm not Kemi's deputy.
Okay, well, it's good to have you with us in the studio this morning. First of all, people will want to know what you made of listening to Justin Welby's comments this morning.
I thought it was a really interesting interview, Laura. And I before I became an MP, one of the jobs I had was working on child protection in the Department for Education. I helped set up Monroe Review of Child Protection with Tim Lawton back in 2010. And I think the first thing that came to my mind when hearing the former Archbishop talk about being overwhelmed, lots of these cases coming across his desk. What's happened to those cases now? Have they all been investigated? Are we confident that everybody's received the response that they're looking for? So I think that really has to be our first priority. And I was quite struck by the fact that this case had gotten missed. So what about the others? So I think, there are clearly some questions to answer there for the Church and ultimately for Mr Welby's successor. And
what about safeguarding more broadly? I mean, Dame Desvinder's told us very clearly this morning that safeguarding, in her view, in the UK is not up to scratch. And when you were in government, there were all sorts of recommendations that you didn't implement that were made by the very eminent Professor Alexis Jay, who looked at this stuff for years and years and years. Why did you not implement all of her recommendations?
But there are practical considerations around a lot of ideas relating to safeguarding. For example, you've been talking this morning about mandatory reporting. And obviously, there are elements of mandatory reporting that seem to make sense. However, as has been pointed out by a lot of people in the past, if you have a very tight regime of mandatory reporting, the risk is that everyone will then over-report because they will be worried that something might be construed in the future as having been possibly abusive, and that they will then be up in court for having not reported it. And the risk is you create a huge haystack of observations that someone then has to pick through, and the real cases might then get lost.
But Professor Alexis Jay, who's an incredibly well-respected expert in this field, who spent, I think it was 7 years, looking at this issue right across the UK, looking at church, grooming gangs, all sorts of things. She was pretty frustrated by the Conservatives' lack of action on this. She said they just need to get on and do it.
Well, there were lots of things that we did do whilst we were in power, Laura, and I've already talked about the Munro Review of Child Protection, which was one of the most far-reaching reviews and changes of its kind. So I don't think it's quite fair to characterise us as having done nothing at all. I'm sure that people, obviously some people...
Nobody said that, but Professor Alexis Jay was very frustrated that the lack of action that was taken after she studied this area for many years.
Yeah, but we obviously did implement many of her recommendations, so I don't think it's fair to criticise us in that way.
OK. Let's then talk about immigration, because the business of Westminster in the next few days is going to be focused on this immigration summit. The government wants to close loopholes relating to casual workers who might be being employed illegally. Will you support them in that?
Yeah, we'll look at the details of that. But this is the wrong end of the problem. The fact of the matter is that when the government came into power last summer, it scrapped the deterrent programme that we had set up, that we had been in the process of implementing.
Well, sending people to Rwanda,
absolutely,
which never happened in any great scale at all, and there was no evidence that it may or may not have worked.
There is firm evidence from Australia that deterrent programmes do work. In
Australia, not the same as here, and Labour can't be sure that it would have been a disaster. You can't be sure that it would have worked.
That was ready to go. And Labour came in, they won a majority, and they scrapped it. There is now no deterrent programme. There is unanimity amongst many agencies that you have to have some form of deterrent. And without that, as you said to the Home Secretary just now, the number of people crossing here illegally has gone up. We now have a 30% rise on the number of crossings from last year because the organised criminal gangs can see that there is no reason for them not to carry on.
Well, that's why the government would say, as we heard from Yvette Cooper, they're trying to stop people working illegally in the black economy. But it's interesting, the former Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who's the one who stood with Stop the Boats blazoned on the lecterns and on every leaflet and Facebook advert going, he said that message was too stark. Is it impossible, actually, to do what you promised to do again and again and again and stop the boats completely?
I think it's perfectly possible to set up an effective deterrent programme that will, at the very least, vastly reduce. And if you get it right, I see no reason why you can't stop crossings altogether.
So you do believe you could stop crossings altogether?
I think it's what you need is a mixture of interventions from deterrence in the Rwanda project that we proposed, alongside much better border patrol. And alongside very severe consequences for people who break the law by coming to this country, that you could certainly dramatically reduce and maybe stop.
Local elections are coming soon, and the Mayor of Tees Valley, Ben Houchen, who's the most senior elected Conservative actually in office in this country, he suggests you should be pretty worried about what's coming. And he said this week, we can show people this in case they didn't read it, we need to do more and we need to work much harder to earn the right for the public to listen to us. We're not doing enough to earn the respect from others, journalists, political parties or the public. Most importantly, of course, the public. What are you getting wrong when people like Ben Houchen, who's in your party, think that you're just not cutting through?
So a new generation has taken over the Conservative Party. We're under new leadership now. And you all have seen 10 days ago, Kemi Badenoch set out first of her major policy speeches this year, where she said we need an entirely new approach to energy. And the purpose of that speech, because the cost of energy is far too high. The cost of energy is far too high. It's currently going up under this government. And it's only by showing that you understand the problems that the country faces and that you are starting to put together solutions to those problems, that we can begin the process of winning back the trust of the British people. And I know that that's what we're going to do.
Who has won, who is in office, he's very clear. He says politics is a street fight. It's not about making speeches at think tanks. He thinks you're getting it wrong. So do you think, is he wrong?
I don't think that politics is just a street fight, Laura. I think it's also a process of working out in detail the solutions to the problem the country faces and presenting them in a fashion that means something to voters. I have every confidence that under Kemi, that's what this party is going to do. OK, well, great to have you with us again in the studio this morning. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Well, with the local election campaigns underway now, in the next few weeks, we will be hopefully hearing from the Lib Dems, Reform and the Greens as well. But let's then return to our main discussion this morning. Many of you have been getting in touch about our interview with Justin Welby. Chris told us, I'm just disgusted by these excuses. I'm sure this is hurtful for the victims. Simon, though, says we don't need perfection, we need honesty. Maintaining reputation is not honest and it keeps us less safe. But John told us, unlike some, Justin Welby has finally done the right thing and others should do the same. Thank you so much all for taking the time to write in, and we'll share some of that in our newsletter on Thursday. Let's, as we close, just talk about the future of the church. I mean, one of the interesting things, Jason, that Justin Welby points out is actually the Church of England has been growing after years of decline. Do you, as a Christian, feel it's still a relevant institution to most people in this country?
Yes, I would say that, and obviously I would as a Christian, but I also recognise that we live in a more secular society.
And do you think that it is realistic for the church to hold together? You know, many countries around the world are part of the Anglican community, often more small c conservative than the UK. Can it stay together?
I don't think it can, because I think there are contexts that kind of compromise aspects of how people engage, you know, in terms of in religion or in Christianity. And I think some of those contexts can sometimes be submerged and they need to be considered in terms of the geographical context. The idea of one person overseeing this, you know, in a geographical context, I think can be problematic at times.
Jane, what about, you know, the Church of England has this formal status in our national life. You know, even though most people aren't a member of the Church of England, we've all got all sorts of different religions, all sorts of different Christian churches too. Do you think it's right that it still hangs on to that formal status?
I mean, it's quite strange, isn't it? Because obviously when you look at, he obviously, as he said, he was at the Queen's funeral, the coronation, etc., and we have this sort of figure of moral authority. And I do wonder now, I was reading a report the other day saying that more young people are coming into the church, but I do wonder in what form that takes, because, you know, is it an online influencer kind of form? I don't know. I mean, I sometimes I was looking at him in that interview thinking, how is he relevant to young people? How is this figure relevant, particularly when this figure has let people down so badly?
And just, Vinda, just finally to you, you've seen the church up close through your particular work on safeguarding. I just wonder, what's your final observation about the future and the church and how it can move on, if it can move on from these issues?
Well, from my perspective, it has to start with survivors, the victims. That's where it needs to start. It's not starting there. And I just have to say, Laura, listen to your interview just then, listening to the politician talk about the concern around a haystack of reporting and being overwhelmed with the suspicion of child protection. Isn't that the point? That is the point. Let's be clear here. Under the new law, unless amended, nobody will be prosecuted for failing to report abuse.
Very interesting. We'll see how that develops, that mandatory reporting legislation. But all three of you, thank you so much indeed for your time this morning. We've been talking about a really important but sensitive subject. Thank you to all of our guests today, of course. I'll be with Paddy O'Connell a bit later for Sunday's newscast on BBC Sounds. And our full conversation with Justin Welby is there on Sounds already and on the iPlayer too. And it will be shown a longer version on BBC Two at 11:35 tonight. Whatever you think of what happened, Justin Welby was part of our national life for more than a decade, and it is compelling to hear what he had to say. And do keep sharing your thoughts with us. And please remember, if you or anyone you know have been affected by any of the issues raised, there is lots of help out there. That's on the BBC website. And I, of course, will look forward to seeing you next week, same time, same place. And don't forget, the clocks have changed, but it's also Mother's Day. So have a good one, and goodbye for now.